I am Juewei with the Humanistic Buddhism Center here in the Tien Institute. And together with me in this quote-unquote studio here is Jasmine Bryn-Smith, who has been taking care of all the magic behind the scenes. And from both of us, we wish all of you auspicious greetings. Welcome to our fifth and final episode of this COVID-19 Detox webinar series. And the title is Immunity in Community. We began this series at the apex of the COVID-19 pandemic, a time when we were all united in the new normal of social distancing, home isolation, and a global pause on production and consumption. We are today sitting here at the end of our webinar series, easing out of our collective quarantine and learning how to restart our world once more. However, there are some big things that may not ever return back as they were. Have the values of our shared humanity, rather than economic self-interest, emerged as guidelines for our future? Today, our conversation will be centered around community and society, moving from me to we. I invite Stephen Hill to share with us some of his insights on our COVID-19 moment in history and lessons learned that we may take with us into the future. Stephen Hill is an Emeritus Professor of the University of Wollongong, Faculty of Law, Humanities and the Arts. Though graduating initially as a research chemist, he also was awarded Australia's first PhD in Business Administration and was appointed as Foundation Professor of Sociology at the University of Wollongong at a ripe old age of 30. He has authored or co-authored 22 books and over 350 publications on major international speeches across 11 disciplines. From 1995 to 2006, he served as the United Nations Regional Director for Science for Asia and the Pacific, and ambassador of the UN agency UNESCO, based in Indonesia and Paris. We are also privileged to have Stephen as advisor to our Humanistic Buddhism Center. Thank you so much for being here with us, Stephen.
My pleasure. Thank you, Juewei.
Together today, we will be exploring three of Stephen's key reflections on the COVID-19 pandemic. First, the old narrative. Second, snapping forward. And finally, embracing community. Before we begin, once again, please allow me to invite all participants to submit any questions you may have into the chat on the bottom tab of your Zoom screen. So, Stephen, let's begin with the old narrative. Many governments are now just starting to limp back slowly to a working economy. In Australia's case, the priority of Prime Minister Scott Morrison and his government is to snap back to our previous pace of life. So what are some pre-COVID-19 attitudes and behaviors that may not have a place in our post-COVID-19 world?
The place we snap back to is unfortunately a place which is highly populated by self-interest and the self. I'll give you a very clear example of this right now in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. It was reported in the New Yorker, there's a hedge fund billionaire called Bill Ackman, who in March this year appeared on CNBC, and he said to it that the collected people of the United States, hell is coming, predicted depression, advocated shutdown of the global economy. 1 week later, his company, Pershing Square Capital Management, announced it had just netted $2.6 billion by netting on the fact that the stocks would go down, okay? $2.6 billion. And other people at the same time are actually buying up the goods that people need desperately, and in one case, increased the price by 1,000%. This is the kind of snapback we could end up in. And just look at it for a minute at some of the consequences. It's a very, very unequal world that we have now acquired. It's not just selfishness or self-interest. It's what I call the grammar that's set by the way the global economy works. And I'll go back even to a lovely quote, which I use frequently from, with great honor, to Hugh Mackay, which he made some time ago, which is, we used to live in a society, now we live in an economy. In other words, what we go back to if we snap back is potentially to a world where the grammar or the culture which surrounds us is one ultimately ruled by self-interest. And this produces all sorts of deviations, like, for example, love. Take love, which is one of the most magnificent emotions or values of possibility. But it gets distorted. It comes in, love is about having, not about giving. So in fact, it becomes embodied in products of beauty or of health or of something which shows that you are better than the guy next to you. So you deserve to be loved. So there are so many ways in which our world in this sense is distorted. And the other final thing which I've mentioned about the danger of going back or snapping back is what might well easily happen to environmental sustainability. I can see it very easily being left on the shelf as it has been so long and so many times, when in fact we are desperately in need of major change. In fact, it was even way back, 1973, that Kenneth Boulding, who wrote some very insightful books, said, anyone who believes that exponential growth could go on forever is either a madman or an economist. And in a sense, this has continued. So we're working, and I'll come back to this in a minute, I'm working with colleagues in Kyoto, particularly trying to look at ways we can replace self-interest with humanistic values in global economics. And one of my colleagues now there is Ladija, who is basically leading most of the circular economy movement in Europe. And what the circular economy movement is doing, and it's actually gaining quite a lot of momentum, is targeted towards business. And its focus is to convert business to an attitude of care that everything is recycled. Now, these are the things we could so easily go back to and lose. What we're talking about today, and we'll obviously go into this right now, is how do we develop from what actually are pretty good roots now, a culture of care, which is a real possibility.
Oh, I really love this term, a culture of care. I'm so glad that you are neither mad nor an economist. So as a sociologist, Stephen, can you give us some advice? So for individuals, as family members, as citizens of our community, how can we prevent a snap back to our previous self-centered attitudes and behaviors?
Look, I'll just make a brief comment now, but I want to come back to it because I need, I think, to talk a little bit more about humanistic values and what we're trying to achieve as part of this. But just a couple of things. The first and probably most important is something that Meg Hart talked about in this detox series last week. And she was quoting from Mahatma Gandhi. What Mahatma Gandhi says is that Mahatma Gandhi said, if you want to make change happen in the world, you have to be the change, not just wait for someone else to do it. You have to be that change yourself. Now, we then look at the sort of things that where the power lies. And the power lies basically around us. It's within our relations to our neighbors, to our friends, to our family, to the people in our intersubjective world. That's where culture is made. It's not made anywhere else. It's made within our intersubjective relations to other people. Now, there's two real powers here, okay? The first one is the very real power, both in economic and social terms, of community, of gathering together, and the power of people working and being together. And I'll come back to that, but these are where the values of culture, of social relations, of care, of integrity, and particularly truth, this is where they lie, it's where they come from. It's where people trust rather than do contracts with each other. And it's lived in people's lives. The second thing is the power of the culture itself. And I'll give you a very specific example of how powerful, if we think in terms of this as this wider framework of culture, of meaning, which we're living within, how powerful this can actually be. And it's quite specifically, when one of the programs I worked on, and it's rather a lot, was after the tsunami in Aceh, where the children, where I think there's about 125,000 children died, where one school I went to, there were only 4% of the children left. 96% had died. Many of the children we worked with had lost up to 40 relatives, and some had even been swept by the wave for 2 kilometers before they survived. The children were silent. They were absolutely, totally traumatized. Now, I've been working with a group which we collectively call Sacred Bridge, working with children caught in conflict or trauma previously, with children caught in Christian Muslim fighting, the street gangs and so on. But it was particularly important with the children of Aceh, because what we did was using music and particularly the main poet of Aceh, a lovely man, was to slowly bring them back into the home of their own culture. And as they became part of that culture, as they basically arrived home again in the meanings that had been torn apart by the terrible trauma of the tsunami, they woke up. We have a film of this, which is just the difference is made over a period of just 2 months working with the children. The power of the culture, of the meaning, of the things that are around us is enormous if we only just capitalize on that, and we can.
That's right. Thank you so much, Stephen, for reminding us of the power of culture. We are seeing it today, aren't we? We see people singing in the streets, socially distanced. We see whole neighborhoods. We see blocks of people singing to Zoom. So, powers of culture.
Yes, and people are coming out in their front yards and communicating with each other, even though they can't actually contact each other physically. It happened on Anzac Day, for example, where people brought out a candle and lit it. It happened with the singing. It's happened with all sorts of other things. The other thing, there were so many demonstrations of people starting to care and pay attention to each other. Young people leaving things in letterboxes of people who might be lonely, for example, say, look, here's my phone number, any trouble, give me a call, okay? I'm finding, in fact, even last night, people that I haven't actually had any contact with for quite a long time ring me up and say, how you doing, Steve? How's life getting on for you? All right, you know? And there's just this extraordinary spread of care. And I think there's ways in which even in government policies we can do this. And I'll come back to this because it fundamentally means focusing not just in what we do and can do, even in our daily jobs and what we do in our life, but also in terms of government policy. It means tilting that government policy towards supporting what happens at the level of the community, not the big end of town. And there's a very good analysis of this by Richard Dennis, who's the chief economist of the Australian Institute of Economics, who points out that putting funding into big corporations or into tax relief and so on does not produce labor. His idea is, in fact, his 3 L's, and that is local, you focus on things that are around you, labor, and long term. And if we then think of even the way that that we got out of the Great Depression back in the 1930s, the whole concept of Keynesian economics was to spend, not to save, and that was mind-blowing at the time. But more than that, it was spending on things that relate to the local. Building back, for example, people's engagement in tourism, in cafes, in doing things that they themselves generate, and even the money that just came out under the current systems of job care and so on. People are starting to spend, and that's where the spending will start and regenerate and regenerate and regenerate and regenerate and build the economy.
That's right. So perhaps this is not what we want to snap back to, and so it's a time for us to move forward and say, well, let's snap forward to an economy and society that's based on humanistic values, to a new narrative of sharing, trust, creativity, care, and all these good things around what we can operate as humanity. So let's look at your experience and what does a society and economy based on human values, what would it look like and how can it be made possible?
Okay. Now, a number of people actually even now are increasingly talking about, they use different words rather than snap forward. I picked up snap forward only because our Prime Minister talks about snap backwards or snap back. And so I just use snap. Snap's not a very good word.
Yeah.
Hugh Mackay and various other people talk about bounce, and that's not too bad. But I'm also finding reports that are coming out from Cambridge University, from people fairly strong writers out of Europe, for example, that are talking now about bouncing forward with a different set of values, given what we've got now. Okay, and these are the humanistic values, rather than values of dominance, of control, of self-interest. But the values, which apart from anything else, are represented in the humanistic values of humanistic Buddhism, but also the values of Christianity and Islam. Not necessarily the institutions, because they sometimes get a bit lost, but certainly the basic values are what the values of spirituality are really about. So let's look at the sort of alternatives and the kind of societies we've got. Firstly, rather than snap back, let's look back. Okay? Let's look over the shoulders of those who've just been creating this economy, because a lot of the things we're talking about are there in traditional society. And back to the quote I took from you. We used to live in a society, now we live in an economy. And I'll give you a very good example that I came across. And it's back to 9/11 in the United States, where the terrorists tore down planes crashing into them two towers in New York. About 4 or 5 months after that, the Maasai people of Kenya came to the United States consulate and donated 14 cows to help the people in New York, in America, okay, with full ceremony, dressed up to the nines with all of their best costumes and flags and all sorts of things. That it was a really, really amazing thing. They gave 14 cows to America to help their support, okay? Now, from America, maybe that might have seemed really silly or whatever else, but look what it represents. The cows are what they live on. That's their food, the blood from the cows. They have no running water. They have virtually no wealth whatsoever. And the cows are the most valuable thing that they can give. Yet they gave it to America, the richest country in the world. Okay. Then we look cross-culturally. Japan. Since the 17th century, Japan has had a set of values which are called umi shunin. That's the merchants, originally from the province of Unin, which still apply in quite a number of companies today. And it's under in Japanese, it's called Sanpo Yoshi, the triple win concept. And the idea of the triple win concept is, and this is practiced, that sellers, buyers, and society all have to benefit, not just the guy who gets the money back. In other words, it's highly ethic behavior. And it means that, and these are things, and this is what I said before, what you and I and everybody else can do in their jobs. And these are the things which, for example, are involved in this particular cultural way of doing things. Share the same ethical values amongst top management and every employee. They are the values we all live by, not just the people in the unions who are trying to get their benefit and against the bosses who are trying to make more profits. Respect the employees, don't just use them. Create and maintain relationships, and this is the key, of trust as opposed to contract, okay? Because with contract, what you're doing, you set it in ink and stamps and all sorts of things run by lawyers who make a large amount of money out of it. But what you're doing is the whole time you're looking for some deviance that you're going to chase them down at a large expense so you get your benefit back. With trust, you don't do that. You trust it just will happen, you know, and it really does work. I found this myself. And finally, support the local community for sustainable development, commit to environmental protection and the effective use of nature rather than its exploitation. Now, these are values now that applied in reasonably broad sectors of Japanese business. Okay, 2 more things. And these are lessons. We're trying to find places where you've got people living by the sort of values I'm talking about. People living with a shared purpose in a community. Now, I can't tell all of this story because there's not enough time, but one of the programs which I did run in Jakarta, where they had terrible pollution running into the Jakarta Bay down the river system, because people just threw everything into the rivers. And we showed, for example, that in the markets, just simply by recycling some of the things that they had, they could save 40% of the rubbish going into the canals, okay? Not only that, they could make money out of it. And then we moved on to a particular village, which is called Bantasari. And we help the people for them to come alive, for them to take control of the things themselves. Until Banjasari, which was a very low-income village, they were poor, they were polluted, they were on the south side of Jakarta, they had very little real benefits at all. But they became the ecotourism, the official ecotourism site of Jakarta, with trees everywhere, with products that they were selling, like herbal products and plants that were going to, for example, high-rise buildings as they'd rent them out. We even helped them get to make recycled paper into origami. But we showed them, we brought a guy from a Japanese department store to show them what's sold in Tokyo, okay? And they were selling direct from this slum village to the people in Japan. And then the kids picked it up, and they, for example, they took kerosene tins, which are, you know, sort of this sort of size and quite small, and they painted them brightly with colours that all related to environmental issues. And they took them out on the streets. They cost maybe 50 cents, the actual tins themselves. They're selling them for about $5 each. And a Frenchman, within the first couple of days, bought 150. And this was their own thing. But they took pride in it, and they formed themselves into a real community of care for each other, and certainly of the environment. And here, all we've got to do is to look what's happening in Australia in rural society. In the course of this COVID-19 pandemic, people are looking after each other. They're helping each other in business. They're supporting people in their community. This is the kind of culture of care which is possible, which is literally available to us right now, as long as we don't destroy it by snapping back into the self-centered values I was talking about earlier.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think what you've just said relates very much to a question that we have from our audience. Let me share that with you. What advice do you have for people concerned about the environment to persuade our government not to lose the momentum generated by the fires?
Okay. Well, we need a wise government. But number one, have you talked, not you personally, or the person who's asked this question, have you actually talked to your own member of parliament and said, look, I value this really matters, okay? They're the guys that their jobs depend on this. And if they don't know that it's important, they're not going to do anything about it. That matters. But just 1 second, if I may, and I slightly go a little bit back. But the point at the moment is this. We have suffered a shock, a big shock. And the point of a shock, like the one we've been through, is that it opens up extraordinary opportunity. And I'll give you a very particular example of that. And it was when I was in Indonesia, and we suffered a revolution in May 1998. Now, the point is that through everything in the air, nothing was taken for granted as it was before. And it allowed me the opportunity, because this was part of my mandate in my ambassador's job there, to completely change the whole of media freedom and freedom of expression in the country, across the whole country, changing the law, building radio stations through the country and linked through internet and so on. It opened up the possibility of changing the very basis of basic education. And for 42 million children, I might add, then instead of being rote learning, the sort of stuff a dictator loves because it comes from the center and they learn exactly what they're told to learn, just opening up the classroom, making it good for creative exercise of the kids, very much like we do in Australia, bringing the parents in because they were completely isolated before, and decentralizing it so that people made their own decisions. Now, we did this. It took a while, I must admit, for 42 million children, opened up by the shock that was then possible. And then the Philippines and Mindanao found out about it, and they said, we want to do this too. So we helped them do it as well. So it was the shock that made all this happen. Now, the second thing is, as what Gandhi was saying before, we have to do it ourselves in terms of our compassion, and this also includes particularly environmental issues and awareness and the way we handle our own recycling and so on. But I think coming back to the issue about convincing our political leaders, we have to get the political leaders to think care. And there's a lovely example from about 2 weeks ago now of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. In Australia and in New Zealand, as the pandemic started to hit, We took people off the homeless off the streets, put them into hotels because they're empty anyway, and gave them accommodation. And the reason for it was to try and stop the pandemic spreading. In New Zealand, instead of throwing them back on the streets, what Jacinda is doing is to immediately start up a program to build social housing and other accommodation so the homeless people don't have to go back on the streets and can start rebuilding their lives. Now, this is the kind of policy of care that I believe we should have also about environment. And it's the sort of thing which I believe we should be pushing, I should say, through our own political systems as well as in our own actions, but particularly pushing this into our own political systems. But again, keeping a clear focus, and I mean, and to me, this is a very, very important thing. And this is very much in line with what Richard Dennis was talking about from the Economics Institute. Focus on the local, focus on the labor, focus, and that includes in recycling and environmental issues and everything else. Focus on where you live and your neighbors and your people and your community. That's where change will really, really, really happen. So he has what he calls the 3 L's, and I think these are very good guide. And they are local, labor, and long-term. But I would add what I call the 5 C's, okay, to this, just to make it really full of acronyms and so on. And they are, my 5 C's are community, cooperation, capacity of labor, that is, capacity, creativity, and I'll come to creativity a bit more in a minute because that actually is a source of value for us now, and care. Or if we were talking about the way, or as Hugh Mackay would say, he would, instead of care, he would say compassion. To me, they're pretty much the same thing. But it's saying that our framework for what we do, ourselves, in terms of what Mahatma Gandhi said, be what you want to change. And that includes environmental issues. But it's also what we seek to influence in terms of those who, as it were, control the framework within which we live, the culture within which we live, the political decisions in which we live, to help them to bounce forward or to snap forward to something new, perhaps based on the values of way back, as opposed to the ones in the last 10 or 20 years of selfness, and to use that as the premise for the way we look at our future, using the care which is already emerging in our communities right now.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think it gives us a lot of hope that these 3 L's and 5 C's can help us to, well, for lack of a better word, right, to step forward. So I can see from how you speak that you're very much into local, into the community, and these humanistic values as exemplified by the 5 C's. But I think person after person, they're telling us that we may experience another shock to the system within the next decade. In your experience as a sociologist, in what ways can this community immunize us from the changes of our turbulent world?
Okay, now the first thing, of course, as a number of people have pointed out, we run a very severe danger that in fact the coronavirus itself will come back as a second wave, possibly even a third wave. And we need to be very conscious and aware of that and not lose the practices which in fact have saved us. And which I should add are practices that show values of care. The fact that we're not on the streets, the fact that we're not sort of causing problems for other people, the fact that we're keeping our distance and washing our hands. These are values of care for other people, not just for us. It's an extraordinary actual thing that's going on. But I think that what we can do is even better able to create values of economic benefit. But I'll come to that in just a second. We confront, apart from these return of possible virus we have at the moment, and we should be prepared as a society for the possibility that another virus, entirely different, will come up. We've had SARS, we've had swine flu, we've had all sorts of other ones not too far in our distant past. We need to be prepared, not just suddenly be shocked by it. But there's another virus which is absolutely on our horizon, okay? And the other virus is being hatched in the cells of very large corporations worldwide, and it is a computer-led technological change, okay? Now, it just so happens I've done a lot of work on this because it's been what I've been doing for very much of my life. There's no question it's going to happen. It will lead to massive, widespread unemployment, okay? Now, if we just relax, get back to things as they were, and we're sort of not prepared for this new, what I call a virus of the future, then we're going to be in bad trouble in some period of time in the future. Now, there's something which people in some countries are exploring at the moment, which affect in some ways we're even implementing right now. And it's the idea of what's called a universal basic income. In other words, an income that is spread through the community virtually without condition, in the sense that it therefore creates an environment which people can live and live well, or at least modestly. Mm-hmm. It creates a basis for spending, which then explodes through the whole economy and so on. But it also allows the possibility of catching the problem as such, which might well emerge as technological change becomes quite different. Whatever happens, when this hits us, and it is going to hit us within 15 years, it will, we have to be prepared for it rather than suddenly, like with the current virus, be shocked and suddenly have to change things all of a sudden and not quite know how to go about it. We should be prepared to think about it in the future. And one thing again, and it is back to community, it's very interesting. At the moment, by the way, my preaching or whatever it might be about humanistic values is actually based on a fair bit of work we've done. Juewei yourself have been involved in helping us create what we call the Kyoto Manifesto for Global Economics. We published that in 2018 with a chapter, I might add, folks, by Juewei on Buddhist economics, which was very valuable indeed. And we had trawled the world for 4 years before that to get the best people we could find, that of course included Juewei, to talk and to help us to see how we could actually replace self-interest with humanistic values in terms of economics. And we did that, okay? Now, one of my colleagues and friends there, Tadashi Yagi, he's head of what's called the Institute of the Center for the Creative Economy in Kyoto, at the Shishi University in Kyoto University. And he points out that in the 20th century, our value in the economy was created out of technology, out of big structures, out of big corporations, and technological change and so on. But what's happening in the 21st century is a change, a real change. And it's towards creativity. Creativity which will come maybe from the guy next to you in the bus, okay? It may be somebody who's in the local environment, the kid that just came out of school and seems particularly bright. It tends to come from local. It tends to come from people who are individuals in that local community environment, rather than just big business. And it's the source of the value of the future, creativity. Now, there's two bits of that. Number one, it goes back to what I keep saying, and that is make sure the funding goes to build the community and build up these kind of capabilities, because that's going to be the value of the future. And it also means, I believe, that we need to, and this should be something, again, you might like to talk to your politicians about, it also should be building an environment for creativity to flower, okay? We pay our school teachers terrible wages compared to countries like Singapore, for example, or for that matter, Finland and other countries in Europe. We don't value the education, the teaching. To take universities, not long back, government provides 70% of the funding for universities. They now provide 30%, okay? That's why the universities are desperately struggling, because that other 70% is mainly coming from selling our soul and bringing in students from overseas, in particular from China. It can be cut off like that, and it has. So that's where our creativity and our values are able to be developed. We need to also emphasize building a creative world, a creative environment, and that also includes being in the arts, the cultures, and everywhere else.
Thank you so much. Stephen, we have some questions. maybe let's look at one particular question first. How can we be more involved in and supportive of community in our post-COVID-19 world?
Well, there's a lot of community organizations which are already there that are very helpful and very useful. For example, for people of my age at least, I think a very valuable organization is the University of the Third Age, just to take an example. There are local clubs, including even things like bowling clubs and everything else, where we're involved in the community and with other people, and where we can have an influence, for example, on the agenda of what people are actually involved in doing. I think we can be involved by taking care and taking question number one. Do you know your neighbors? Do you ever talk to them? Do you ever think about things that maybe they might need? Have you ever said to your neighbors, well, you know, are you okay? Can I help you in some way? Can I do the shopping? Because we can see you're a bit, you know, that Zimmer frame is getting a bit rusty. Maybe you need someone to do the shopping for. And in other words, we can do things ourselves in the community and create that community. One of the things which I would then particularly note is that if we have a common, the strongest thing of building a community, to build a community, is to have a common purpose. Okay. Now, in my own experience living in Sydney, as a matter of fact, this was very important when I lived in Glebe in the very early 1970s, where the problem we had was two expressways that would go right through the middle of Glebe and destroy it. Now, I won't go into the longer story here, but it ended up with the Green Band movement coming in to back us up and so on. But the point of it was that having built this community, and it involved some younger people like myself just having moved into the suburb to live as an academic or whatever else, but it also involved the old age pensioners, the bikie just around the corner and so on. And we got to know each other, and we got to care for each other because we had a purpose, okay? Now, if you look around in the environment you personally live in, if you talk to your neighbors and if you talk to the people that you see at the coffee shop and elsewhere, and you find something that would be a really good project that everyone would really find, or most people would find very valuable for themselves, that's a terrific start for building the power of the community.
Thank you, Stephen. There's a comment here from Irene who says that building resilience and ability to persevere is what is needed with adaptability, with love for our neighbor. If my neighbor is hurting, so am I. And we need skills, knowledge, and values to live with any adversity. And I think the pandemic is teaching us a lot about these skills for adversity. So finding problem-solving solutions and answers need to be focused on in the generations that will be facing many of these problems. What do you think, Stephen?
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. The kids are growing up into this, and they have not had the experience we have, at least I have, since, well, I don't remember much about 1943, but that's when I was born. That's quite a long time back, in the middle of the war, towards the end of the war. But I certainly know what society was like in the 50s, and the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. And each one of these, including some of the trauma during those times, some of the things that were bad, in many ways, it's these confronting these things and dealing with them that starts to help you build your own well of wisdom and understanding, I think, that really matters. So bad times are not necessarily bad times in another way. They can actually help you. Now, the kids are coming up. They're coming into a very, very different world to us. And for example, your 4-year-old child or grandchild will probably know more about the computer than you do. So they're living in a virtual world in a way that I can't. If I have a problem with my computer or anything else, I call my grandson and bring in an expert, because I know I can't solve it, but I'm sure he can. So they're living in this world, and particularly in a world of social interaction, social communication, networking and computer-based things like Facebook and so on. Now, the first thing about that, which I think is very, very, very important, and this is very important for young people, is to start helping them recognize what truth is. Because, for example, on internet, something will be posted by somebody with no basis at all in terms of what it represents. Mr. Trump is particularly good at it. but it will get 1 million followers. And when it gets 1 million followers, it becomes truth because everybody believes it. But in fact, it's got no basis at all. And I actually directly saw this would have been about 5 or 6 weeks ago now. And there was a report that came out about the Ruby Princess or whatever it was, the ship which came into Port Kimberley.
That's right.
And it was that it was all connected back to one of the Prime Minister's top ministers, and the Prime Minister perhaps himself was why all this happened. The reporter who actually did the report on Prime Minister Morrison being in Hawaii, who therefore was not necessarily a friend of Prime Minister Morrison, immediately did an analysis of this and said, this is absolutely wrong. It is completely and totally and fully untrue, okay? I looked at the internet about 2 hours later. 16,000 people had already picked up this message, probably because they believed it, okay? Now, young people, I don't think, can have any idea of this, okay? And that means, I think, the sort of values we're talking about in our own lives and experience of those lives are things which we really need to help the kids find for themselves. We need them to find it, not teach them, tell them, whatever, ourselves, because they're not going to listen anyway. We know that. But to help them start to understand what the world is that they're in, what the truth is within that world, and what the distortions are that they're likely to confront, and to help them find a path that really matters for themselves into this world and into the future.
I think that Irene agrees with you, because in her comment, she says that her children and grandchildren all feel entitled. She thinks that they all need to be guided into problem solving for themselves rather than have things handed to them and live in this real world. So true. Okay, so here is a question from Nalanka. I had an incident yesterday where a friend was quite angry for me calling to say hello. She said she prefers to read the papers and do gardening. How do we deal with these situations? Especially now that we're talking about community, but somebody now prefers isolation.
I think self-isolation has been interesting in terms of things that people have learned from it, apart from anything else. One of the things, again, I quote Hugh Mackay because he's a very wise man and he's a friend, and I think he says some very good things. He pointed out, for example, that one of the things people started to recognize was they didn't have to be so busy anymore. Okay, being self-isolated and staying off the streets and doing other things, you didn't have to do all those things you used to do every day of the week, night and day, and so on and so on. We can learn from the self-isolation. Equally, what perhaps we should learn from isolation is the fact that there are many people and they're isolated and everybody else just walks past them. Okay. I used to, up until about 3 or 4 months ago, I used to run the programs for retired United Nations people in Australia. And we'd have a lunch twice a year. And needless to say, these are all retired people, so they got old, quickly. That seems to happen when you get older. And we'd lose a few every year. But increasingly, a number would be in old people's homes and so on. Every one of these people had fantastic stories. One guy, he may not be there anymore, was actually one of the translators at the armistice at the end of World War II. Another woman was one of the first employees of the United Nations. Other people had been in Tanzania or Ethiopia or places in Africa. They'd been in security forces that had been restoring order in Timor. And I'll give you a very specific, a beautiful example of that in a minute. But nobody talked to them anymore. Okay? So what I always did was to then ring around the people who hadn't answered and just have a talk to them. That's all I could really do. But and there's a program on TV not long back, many people would have seen this, bringing children into old people's homes. Okay, it woke up those old people. They became suddenly alive. But I think it also made a big difference to the children when they could see what really meant out there. Okay, so we should be conscious that many people are really isolated and nobody talks to them. They're very lonely. All they do all day is probably watch TV, wait for dinner, go to bed, get up in the morning, wait for breakfast, watch TV. Nothing happens in their lives. It's all gone. We should be very conscious of this isolation.
That's right. And I hope that our lives can be filled with the diversity of humanity. It can be rich, and it can be so rich inside of us. So sometimes when people get angry with us, they may not be angry with us. They could be angry with themselves and their lives. And it calls for us to be more understanding and more empathetic. Perhaps on this note, I would like to invite everyone perhaps to take a 1-minute break with some light music so that we can collect our thoughts. If any questions come to your mind, just park them for now. And after we come back from this minute break, you're most welcome to put your questions into your chat room. Thank you. I'd like to thank Ling Ling Su from Brisbane, who composed this music especially for us. It's such beautiful music. Well, in the Q&A panel, I received a question asking about what is the core concept of Buddhist economics? So I thought I'll take this opportunity to respond, if you don't mind, Stephen. In our book on the Kyoto Manifesto for Global Economics, I had the privilege of contributing a chapter on Buddhist economics, a cultural alternative. In Buddhist economics, the currency is something called merit instead of credit. We're not thinking of, me and what I can get more of, but rather merit. What can I give more of? In Buddhist economics, people is not just a factor of production as they are in today's economics. Instead, people is what economics is for. Economics is for the benefit, the well-being of individuals. So that is why we come into a transaction of supply and demand for the benefit of the greater good. So it's not about more, and growth. So GDP, I think, is a very weak indicator of economic progress. Instead, it is the well-being of a society that is important. And in that chapter, we talked about, for example, Bhutan with its gross national happiness indicators. Also, Thailand with sufficiency thinking. Of course, it takes a much broader discussion around the ideals of Buddhist economics. But it comes back to why we have economics to begin with. It's for well-being, and it's for the well-being of the greater good. Hope that answers your question. Next, we have another question, Stephen. Perhaps you can take this one. How is an economy of creativity feasible?
Sorry, how is it created?
How is an economy of creativity feasible?
Creativity comes very much from the person being involved and being creative. I think the first thing is to actually have an environment that is a creative environment, rather than one that drives people into the need to be at work 9 to 5, do just things that require them to sort of go to and from and so on and so on. One of the things that really seems to be a positive product, for example, of working from home is that may well actually have started a new way in which people will start to change the way of work, where people have more freedom in terms of both commuting, in terms of being at home and so on. So number one about creativity, you need to have time and space, right? Number two, I think you need to have stimulation of some sort that allows you to be creative, to actually be encouraged. And I think part of that is actually being engaged or having creative enterprise going on around you and with you and so on. Plays in the street, for example, theatre, exhibitions of art, yourself involved in art, no matter how good or bad you are. Remember Grandma Moses in the late 80s, I think, started off and became a famous artist before she was 90. I mean, there's still hope for all of us in some time in the future, you know. I mean, we can be creative, but as far as we can do it, it's ourselves, it's our own abilities. And we all are creative, I haven't say, in some way. But it's just often ground down into daily life rather than allowed to flower. And I think we create an environment to allow that flower to grow.
That's right. And I think creativity also can come through teamwork. And you are a big believer in interdisciplinary creativity. So,
absolutely. But let me add just one more thing to that. And I think it's related to creativity. I think it's fundamental to all the things we're talking about. And it's something which I've talked about. And I know Hugh Mackay also talks about quite a lot. And it's the power of listening, okay? Really listening means not just waiting till the person finishes and jumping in, because I found most people, I find, listen to intervene, not listen to understand. They're just waiting for the person to finish so they can say, but I know, you know, and so if you're yourself. It's a matter of putting yourself in the other person's life, basically. Maybe at the end of it saying, you know, was this what you really mean, you know? Rather than jump in and sort of make judgments and say that I think the following and so on and whatever. People rarely listen. There was actually a rather interesting exercise in sociology, which we could do way back, I was teaching. And it was in a seminar room where people are talking, to give each person a green and a red flag, okay? And what would tend to happen in a seminar quite frequently, I hate to say it, was young men who really were sort of in there, apparently it was the future. They'd be off and running and they'd be giving a really strong talk about all important things, thinking everyone was really listening. But then they'd look around the room and they'd see that everyone had a little red flag up. Red flag meant I'm not interested anymore. It was very powerful.
that's right.
But I mean, being able to listen, to really seek to understand across the culture, across the person, is critical.
Irene has a comment to say the power of listening with your ears and listening with your heart is so important. And that is grounded on a strong belief in interdependence. If we know that we are strongly interdependent, we'll be inspired to listen.
Absolutely.
It's a question by Zhi here. How different will houses of worship respond to people's needs while living through this pandemic and post-pandemic?
That's going to be interesting. I mean, I'm no expert on this at all, but what I do find, for example, and I was talking to an ex-minister or a retired minister last night, as a matter of fact, and even with the constraints, for example, of being able to gather together, they are still having Zoom meetings with the people. So the meetings are actually going on as well. I think that houses of worship, they can be just the rituals, I should say, of the past and be not more than that. Well, they can be houses of care. And that, to me, is what really will matter in terms of the redevelopment of the houses of worship.
Oh, that's so beautiful to think of houses of care.
Yeah.
And to think that who will care? We will care for one another. That's very empowering indeed. So final question, what are some simple principles we can adopt when playing a part in our global economy to ensure we are promoting human values rather than for self-serving purposes only?
I think it firstly says what we're producing, what we're selling, what we're bringing into trade in the place Number one is not just shoddy stuff. We're trying to actually do something that matters. I think it means that the sort of not just the products themselves that go into trade, but the terms of trade, the way we develop the trade, the ways we develop the relationships are ones also of sharing, not just of exploiting across the countries, which is so often the case in terms of trade. I think it then means that we also look at trade not in terms of exploiting others, which, for example, we do by capturing trade, which really is based on the sweat labor of people in poor countries like India and China to produce products that we get cheap and think are terrific because it only costs us $3 to do something. But really behind that, there's a whole world of inequity, which is building and which is starting that. I think we have to question that. We need to look, to interrogate, to listen to what the trade really is in terms of human relationships and quality.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Before we close today's session, do you have a few words of wisdom for our participants?
I don't know about the wisdom. But yeah, look, a couple of things just to note at the end, I think. Just this is to some extent a summary back. I'm suggesting we resist at all cost flipping or moving or bouncing back. But I also think we can look over our shoulders backwards to the society from which we came and the values which held people together in community, and we can find this in the world around us. Now, people often talk, for example, about the Chinese word for crisis, and you can correct me about this, but it's Weiji, I think. Is that correct?
It is correct.
In Chinese, I believe it really means two things, danger and meeting a critical point. But in the West, it has been turned around a little bit, particularly by JFK, the president, to say that crisis has two things in it, danger and opportunity. And that's caught on. It's not, I believe, it's not quite what the Chinese actually says, but that's what it is said to mean. And it's true. The shock we've confronted is opened up care. It's opened up opportunity. Let's hang on to that. In terms of action, I think, remember in particular Mahatma Gandhi, be what you want to change. Don't just leave it to everybody else. I think we focus on the people around us, our community and humanistic values, and we can do that. The way we walk into work tomorrow morning, on Monday morning, for example, do we walk in with the values of care and concern for other people, or we just walk in to do the job we used to do before without really paying much? We can do that now. We can do that now. We can be that thing, but particularly focus on community. I think we then start to encourage government, and including by going to talk to your local member or intervening with them in some way, to say, please focus on community as a core focus of action and building community and building care into that community and into policy as the basis for moving forward rather than flipping or whatever it might be, going backwards to the previous step. I think we can talk or think about further about the idea of what might happen in 15 years, and we should be prepared for. We should be very prepared for the possibility of another virus. It could happen easily, but we should even be more prepared for the fact that we will confront massive unemployment from technological change. And we should not just be surprised by it when it comes. We should think about things like universal basic income. And finally, if I may suggest, I go back to these acronyms such as those of Richard Dennis and me, and I'll just remind you, well, no one will probably remember them, but remember three L's and 5 C's, okay? 3 L's are easy: local, labour, long-term. My 5 C's are community, which I've talked about a lot, cooperation, which is the whole concept of community, capacity, that's of labour, creativity, which I think is our future, and fundamentally about care, or as Hugh Mackay would call it, compassion. I think we prepare for our future. We prepare for our future based on the strongest thing we have, and that's the power of our humanity.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for reminding us of what it means to be human. And It is kind of like getting away from the old narrative of me, and more, but instead to step forward to the 5 C's and to embrace community, to build this culture of care as we move forward. Pandemic, whatever it is, post-pandemic, whatever it turns out to be, we have to ride the wave. So if you are interested to hear more from Stephen on this topic, please visit our NTI HBC SoundCloud site for his very insightful podcast on immunity in community. Thank you to you, our listeners, for your patience and questions. Please accept my apologies if we have not managed to attend to your comments and questions. I invite you to continue to send us any doubts you may have, any questions, comments via study@nantien.edu.au. We will continue our partnership with community leaders to incorporate your concerns into our courses and community projects. We hope that you have found some gems of knowledge useful to you from our Detox webinar series. This series of COVID-19 Detox webinars was held in a month of change, and our topics fortuitously mirrored that change. This month started with continuing anxieties about the lockdown that started on 31st March 2020 in New South Wales, and hence we started with Shelter in Place with Roshi Dr. Susan Murphy. The public is aware of the dangers of isolation for the vulnerable, and so helping from home with Associate Professor Garwin Powell Davis was an insightful discussion of how bodhisattvas could assist. With the New South Wales government relaxing lockdown restrictions from the 15th of May, Tie's maintaining a steady mind on 16 May was such a timely reminder of how we should view the shift in increased liberty. Meg Hart's experience last week also told us how her experience as a life coach and her personal journey made her self-coaching for transformation real for many people. Finally, immunity in community today with Emeritus Professor Stephen Hill-Marks, how we shift our attention from individual dukkha or dis-ease into social dukkha as Australia faces post-pandemic realities. All things, good or bad, must come to an end. This is our Buddhist principle of impermanence.
Juewei, 2 words from me, please. Firstly, Thank you for guiding and creating the series, the Detox series. I think they've been magic and magnificent. And thank you, those who are sharing this webinar with us. Thank you so much for being part of our own meeting and time together.
Yes, and we thank you very much, Stephen. And so for everyone else, do follow our NTI Facebook and check our emails to you as we build this culture of care in a more enlightened society together. Finally, as in all our webinars, we will end with a transfer of merits.
Let us now dedicate the goodness of what you have done to all living beings. May kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity pervade all worlds. May we cherish and build affinities to benefit all beings. May Chan, Pure Land, and precepts inspire equality and patience. May our gratitude and humility give rise to great vows.